Welcome to this webinar, Dismantling White Supremacy in Public Service Organizations and Society, Part 1. This webinar is being sponsored and held by the Section on Democracy and Social Justice of the American Society for Public Administration. My name is Sean, and I'm currently chair of this section. And I'm joined by Prentiss Dantzler, our stellar social media editor, as well as several DSJ board members, Dr. Brandy Blessed and Dr. Nicole Diggs. And we're really proud to be joined today by two amazing panelists, Dr. Prentiss Dantzler of Georgia State University and Dr. Kathleen Yang-Clayton of the University of Illinois at Chicago. So thank you to both of you for joining us. And before getting started, we in DSJ and our panelists thought that it would be helpful to provide some context to this webinar. We're going to be sharing some links with you throughout these opening statements, and it's important to put this in the context of this. As Dr. Susan Gooden recently noted, we are currently experiencing a double pandemic, COVID-19 and racism. COVID-19 disproportionately affects communities of color, with mortality rates sometimes twice as high as those in white communities. And those from historically marginalized communities are often not able to exercise the luxury and privilege of social distancing. And further, recent police killings of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Rayshard Brooks, and many more the vast majority in this country never hear about, as well as both public and private responses to these killings, showcase anti-Blackness fully and unapologetically on display. And as we note in our section's recent statement, we declare this must stop. There can be no dismantling of racism without dismantling white supremacy. The realities we must grapple with that this country has a racist, white supremacist history and remains so, is founded for the benefit of select few, white male property owners, and this unjust legacy continues to this day, despite gradual advancements evident in constitutional amendments, federal and state laws, and some changes in societal perspectives. More simply, as disparities due to COVID-19 police killing than many other examples, the system continues to impugn and marginalize communities of color, women, LGBTQ persons, and intersectionalities between these and more. Racism and white supremacy make it impossible for public administration to live up to its highest mandate to improve people's lives. So again, as part of DSJ, we declare this must stop. And this webinar is the first of several we are going to be holding on this topic. Tomorrow, we'll be addressing these issues through the lens of ethical competency and education, featuring these great guest speakers. Later this month, we'll examine intersectionalities in the LGBTQ+ community. And throughout July, we will offer 3 more webinars on dismantling white supremacy, starting with dismantling it in the academy, in the criminal justice system, and in and through nonprofits. And you can see the great speakers we have lined up here. And as we create flyers and RSVP links for these events, we'll share them on our listserv and social media, and we hope you'll join us. So without further ado, let's get to our speakers. So we have, again, Dr. Prentiss Dantzler, Georgia State University, and Dr. Kathleen Yang-Clayton of the University of Illinois, Chicago. Thank you for joining us. And we're going to be starting with 3 opening questions that we co-developed with our speakers and then proceed to audience Q&A. If you would like to ask a question, please wait until the Q&A portion and indicate so in the chat box. If you'd like to be unmuted, please indicate that in your message. And Prentiss Dantzler, our social media editor, will be taking the lead in managing the Q&A portion. So with that being said, I'm going to stop the screen share right now, and I'm going to be copying and pasting our first question for the benefit of everyone, so our guest speakers can see. So here is our first question. What is white supremacy, and how is it and racism linked, especially in public service organizations like government agencies, nonprofits, and so forth? And either of you wants to go first. It's all good.
To Prentiss, you were unmuted first, so you go.
Okay. So thank you for having me today. I'm hopeful that these are just the beginning of discussions and ongoing kind of processes and interventions so we can really get to the crux of this argument. My understanding, and for me, white supremacy is this kind of overarching belief, right, as a political system or a higher belief system that white people and whiteness is a superior, at a superior level. And for me, to understand racism as just one practice that upholds this larger political economy where we really understand it. And we see this kind of functioning through different public service organizations through a number of ways. One is that how we understand the work that we are doing in terms of public service, right? And a lot of times in public administration, public affairs, we see this as a a bit of a savior type complex, right? So these are like goods and services and public resources. That are not owed to these communities or these groups or these racial groups, but something that is provided by institutions at large. The other point is that when we think about white supremacy, there is this proximity to whiteness, right? And it gets manifested in ways where we think about what are kind of the evaluation or the metrics or the assessment tools that we are using in different kind of assessment policies and practices within public organizations. And to me, kind of really coming from a public administration background, but more so of an urban studies or urban policy focus, a lot of this discussion has been framed around outside of public administration, right? So in a lot of ways, critical race scholars have been doing this work outside of public administration, and the field of public administration tends to be a little bit late to the game. So in a lot of ways, a lot of the issues that we see at the local level, whether it's institutions, whether it's nonprofits, non-governmental organizations, or even the role of the government, or some intersection or interplay between these groups, kind of reproduces these qualities. So for me, white supremacy is this overall kind of larger political economy built on this belief of whiteness as superior, and racism is but one tool within this kind of broader economy that we can really talk about today.
Oh, that was awesome. Thank you. That really kind of framed it for me. So thanks everyone for joining us. I think one of the things that we also imply when we talk about white supremacy is also anti-Blackness. And a lot of my work does focus on the ways in which the different procedural rules within the internal environment of organizations land differently. And we can see that happening because at a certain level of supervision, you see a certain group, a certain racial group, either predominating or being omitted. And so anti-Blackness is sort of that other side of the coin. And that runs through a lot of different communities, whether it is in the Black community or within the Asian American community. Anti-Blackness is absolutely operative intra-racially, and it's challenging. I do think that a lot of this work has happened outside of public administration. Just to be honest, I joined the field 3 years ago. I had been a practitioner doing legislative advocacy on behalf of Asian American and Pacific Islander communities. And I found that this discipline is actually really appealing because there is so much practical, like real hands-on opportunities that we have to take some of the theory and actually apply it. I do think that sometimes it kind of, it could be informed better. So taking this question of proximity to whiteness and this idea in the discipline that we're about making everyone who comes to this discipline technically competent. And that strikes me as being very close to this concept of impartiality that critical race theorists such as Iris Marion Young have developed outside of this discipline and could be directly dropped in and used to interrogate the ways in which these claims around impartiality or technical competence and stuff really needs to be interrogated. And the one last thing I wanted to point out about white supremacy and how it's linked is all of us, whether you are white or not white, do not benefit from white supremacy. It reduces the effectiveness of our institutions and our organizations because of the practices, the violent practices on self that it requires. So I really think that when we do bring this into spaces where people aren't as comfortable talking about this, we really also have to make sure that we connect this discourse and this language and this new vocabulary with really pointing out the ways in which government and nonprofits have been less effective because we haven't addressed these issues. I'll stop there.
Excellent, excellent. So we have some people joining us. Just so everyone knows, we will be going through 3 questions that we developed with our panelists, and we are actually just getting to the second question before we open it up to audience Q&A. So the second question, which I am sharing through the chat right now, is why should both individuals and public service organizations dismantle racism and white supremacy and build structures and processes of inclusion?
I think I'll take the lead on this one. I think for me, my argument would be for a number of reasons. One is that I think a lot of times we have to take a step back and realize why certain institutions were created in the first place, right? So a lot of times I think we assume that institutions are there for the benefit of the public, and we know historically that has not always been the case. So the idea that individuals and public service organizations should be engaged in this work needs to be a commitment, but that's not central to their organization or their guiding principles a lot of times, right? When we think about how public goods and services are actually distributed or handed out, it tends to be for ideas of efficiency, right? And in a lot of the ways we lose equity within that kind of narrative or those discussions. Furthermore, I think depending on our kind of particular area of expertise, right, what kind of subfield within public administration, whether we're working in social services, housing, the environment, criminal justice, education, a lot of times we have kind of biased or racialized understandings of how institutions should work, right? So in a lot of times we think about what should be the right ways to do public service work, we're still operating at a place that's very much been racialized and tends to be reproducing racism within our practices and policies. And more on this point, I think my argument would be, if we're really trying to really dismantle white supremacy, that is not a commitment that should be just from one particular organization, but a holistic look at what we do. And what I mean by that is that the organization as a whole, the institutions as they're working with each other, and we understand that institutions normally don't work with each other, right? So we tend to do very much siloed work in these areas and then try to find overlap. And we were even just recently talking about how this kind of momentum around everything that is going on has raised attention. But for a lot of us that have been working in different areas, these are not new disparities, right? So the understanding of like these health outcomes of COVID-19 are not new. When we talk about the position, right, of people to whiteness, but also the position, whether in terms of their social economic status or for me, is housing policy. So a lot of my work deals with like these ideas of segregation and gentrification. These are not new, but reproductions that have largely been existing long before these discussions, or even these kind of academic discussions or even practitioner discussions. So I think if we are true to really think about the work that we do and how to get to these kind of equitable solutions, if that is really the goal, then dismantling white supremacy, but also addressing our own institutional racist or racist practices and policies is a first step. And I think a lot of times we kind of think about these as systems of inequality and these kind of quick fixes, but this is ongoing work. And my fear to a lot of these discussions is that we're beginning these conversations and we'll have these quick fixes, and we can see this kind of reproducing itself in a number of statements that are coming out, right? But if we don't have action items or policy interventions or program changes or analyses or evaluations, then we're not going to get to the kind of systemic change which a lot of us are calling for, even within our respective areas.
It's fun following after Dr. Dantzler, because I just take notes and I can just pick up on things. I think that one thing, just to backtrack for a second, because the question is, what is white supremacy? What's an example? And as we were preparing for this this webinar, so I'll give you an example. Probably a lot of you that work in this space and have been working in this space have noticed an uptick in phone calls or urgent emails for your input. And I mean, basically, what I'm seeing here in my perch in Chicago is that a lot of foundations and even government agencies are trying to throw money at this. And this is an example of white supremacy. Why? Because I'm getting calls from nonprofits or from public service leaders who are like, I just got this call and this one foundation wants to give me $1.5 million to basically fix racism in 2 years. Can we do it? I'm like, no. It's like, please say no. Okay, that is a form of white supremacy. How is the decades that our social service organizations and governments have been starved of resources, and the expectation right now that somehow, if I raise $2 billion in an endowment and hand it out, things are going to change. I really do think that this is that moment where we all have to think about the ways that we are also responding to white supremacy, and we're trying to be responsive, or just buckle down and sort of move through the humanity of this moment as quickly as possible to try to get to solutions. And I really don't think that's going to work this time. I really don't. The second piece to that is you know, these protests are working. The protests are actually working right now. And I'll be really specific. I think that one of the things that I've seen that the protests are doing is really what I call changing the demand curve. In the programs that we're in, right? So I've gotten more inquiries from colleagues about what is this racial equity stuff? Like, why is this important? Like, how do we build this into, because students, whether you're on a master's or undergrad, they're starting to ask about this. They're just starting to select on this. They want to see commitment, and they want to see that they're going to learn about this in a really intentional and real way. So the demand curve in that sense for me, like, I'm like, okay, this is interesting, right? Because I didn't really feel this beforehand. So, I mean, I just wanted to sort of like cap off, like, there's just interesting ways that this is starting to just show up in, I think, in a lot of our worlds. The one thing I just would want to highlight is, you know, this question is very dense. And the one piece I just wanted to kind of uplift is, you know, the dismantling part is absolutely required. We see this right now in the debates that are starting to swirl about what it means to defund the police and what that means. And then the question that I tend to focus on a lot is, what is the process of inclusion? How do you actually build inclusive structures and processes when people are going to be very resistant to that? And so in the case, for example, of just, you know, I think it was like Angela Davis recently said something like, you know, that defunding isn't just about getting rid of funding, it's shifting funding to new services. And so my interest here is, if you're a tiny little community-based organization and you've been running a really great program, like let's say there's an organization here in Chicago called the Logan Square Neighborhood Association, and they have a program that's been funded by the state to the tune of maybe $1 million, maybe $1.5 million every year, to actually train parents to become parent mentors, to teacher assistants, right? Which has shown an amazing impact. You don't need a cop in a school, right? You bring someone's mom into a classroom or dad, that's gonna have an effect. But this program's been around for over 10 years and it's never gotten funded beyond a certain point. And the scalability of a program like this, we have to carefully think about how we actually build a process of inclusion that allows an organization that has remained a certain size to scale in an intentional and sustainable manner. Like, all of these things are starting to really pop up, and I'm excited by the possibilities of building this out and the role that public administration can play. But I agree with Prentiss and with Sean and with a lot of members of the DSJ, if we aren't really intentional about how white supremacy is showing up and pushing us in certain directions, then we may be setting ourselves up to fail.
I want to follow on that
Please.
point a little bit, because this comes up, and I think this is the narrative in terms of, and I'll talk specifically about criminal justice and this idea of the defunding of the police. I think it is working in a lot of spaces to really think about how much we fund police compared to other social service organizations. I think the other piece of it is to think about that other social service organizations also do their own style of policing. And I think that's really important in terms of, like, when we talk about welfare reform, when we talk about social welfare programs, that is a different type of surveillance and policing that goes on outside the realm of criminal justice. And I think a lot of times we kind of co-opt this idea. Even I did my graduate work in Rutgers Camden, and that the Camden Police Department has been used as a case study to understand what defunding of the police. That's not the right narrative, right? Because that was not the same type of defunding that people are calling for in this particular nature. The idea of Camden being defunded was because the city got defunded and it became a metro police force, right? So it was a way to shift the tax burden and the funding of that police force outside of the city to the county level. And I think a lot of times when we talk about what it means to defund the police, it's one, really just calling for equitable resources within the other spaces, which historically we haven't seen that type of, those type of opportunities, right? So even when we think about housing policy, and this is what I do, so I'll just talk about that. But even when we think about affordable housing, right? we're not just talking about creating affordable housing, we're also talking about increasing the amount of housing vouchers. We're also talking about restoring public housing to levels that it historically was. We're also talking about dismantling racism within that. And I think for kind of this understanding of how and we talked about this a little bit before, but the reason a lot of us function within public administration, right, is that we have our own particular sense of reality. And I think for me, it's really thinking about how do I come to this position to think about what is the role of institutions or public service organizations and why do they actually exist? And to understand that the role of the nonprofit or the non-governmental sector or the public sector, at some points for even local community groups, may be to address or alleviate issues rather than solve the problem. And to be honest about those conversations and like the work that we're doing, right? So this is something I learned years ago about being a tutor. Your job is to get that student to not come to you ever again, right? To give them tools and training and skill sets so that you are no longer needed by them, right? And I think this sometimes it gets co-opted in terms of self-sufficiency, but a lot of times we need to kind of understand like, what is the environment by which we can provide the goods and services for people to make their own decisions, to be their own agents within their lives, and understand that a lot of times when we're thinking about the role of nonprofits and government, these are services and resources that are owed to the community that pay into the overall system. Mm-hmm. And I think really contextualizing this understanding of the police force as one entity, right? But also how we think about how does racism and institutional practice that perpetuate racism exist and get reproduced across institutions. And a lot of times I feel like people or administrators or practitioners at their local level, because of their own organizational demands, can't have those conversations. And for us to really think about what does it mean to like really dismantle white supremacy, we have to interrogate the reason for institutional existence or the reasons why these organizations should be practicing or practice in the first place.
Yeah, not to carry this too much further, but I would be remiss if I didn't point out that it's been interesting. A lot of the racial equity work that I got exposed to was before I joined public administration. So for many of you who do this type of work, there has been an organization around for a very long time called the Government Alliance for Racial Equity. Their work has benefited hundreds of municipalities, but when I got into public administration, it was like, wait, what are they? What do they do? Who do they work with? And there's a gap. And the big thing about their work that I think those of us who are in public administration who want to look at the internal environment is the point that Prentiss was talking about, across institutions, and then it's within an institution. Mm-hmm. The internal environment, often the number of times, I know a lot of you have been there where something happens in the community and people have to scramble. So they're either setting up a commission or some committee, or they're like, let's do a bunch of public hearings. And they don't even pause to think that the frontline staff or just the street level bureaucrats or just the people who are inside a city who's may have also gone through trauma and may also be continuing to go through trauma because there is absolutely no consideration of them as members of the community, of a community that should be considered. So there is also that internal work that is, I would start from there. I almost never take on a project, or if I don't see that within a public agency, whether it's the forest preserves or a municipal government, if you don't have buy-in from the highest levels to actually empower a committee or a group of people to really interrogate how the internal environment is reproducing trauma and anti-Blackness and all of that, then why put forth the effort to try to pull a commission together? Where is that going to actually land? So it's interesting, all of those different layers. Sorry.
Now this is wonderful. We're already receiving some questions over private message. I know some people have just come in. Just so everyone knows, we're asking 3 questions that we co-developed with our panelists. We just got done with question number 2, about to discuss question number 3, and then we'll be opening up for audience Q&A. So I will be again putting this question in the chat. So the 3rd question is this: what are techniques to dismantle structural racism and white supremacy and build structures and processes of inclusion?
Kathleen, you want me You want to go first? Because I feel like I'm.
Well, I get so much from hearing you. Okay. Wait. So techniques. Okay. I'll try to make this
Yeah, we
short.
can have more of a conversation too, so we can go
Yeah.
back and forth.
Like
Yeah.
when we're talking about this, it's like, look, there's in a nutshell, there's two levels. Okay, everyone knows this, right? There's like kind of the individual and interpersonal level, right? That work that has to happen. Often you see things like implicit bias trainings or racial identity caucuses or things that have to happen at that level. And then there's the institutional, systemic, societal. 95% of my work really has been focused on institutional change. But again, like what I am starting to realize just in the past 3 weeks and just seeing how important it is. I'll be honest, like the individual stuff often like escaped me. I was just like, I don't know, implicit bias. I read stuff, they say it's not effective, whatever. But there is something really profound, like philosophically profound, in the way that generationally we have seen young people just responding and saying this is unacceptable. There is something on an individual, like just ontological level of being that I feel like has benefited the institutional work like 1,000-fold. So I will never discount it at all because it's made the institutional work that much easier. Because people are starting to realize, oh my God, like we can't have this happening. Like we can't hire good staff. We can't retain them anymore. They don't want to come work for us because they think our organization's racist. I mean, there's just that happening. So there's a sea change on the individual level. It's really important. But institutionally, I see more organizations and more agencies, municipalities starting to put resources into understanding how to use racial equity as a way of doing organizational change, primarily because when you get into a project, you realize that we do this race equity work on an institutional level, or at least I do it, partially because, yes, it's the right thing to do, but also because right now, government is not in a great place. Lack of trust, lack of effectiveness. And so when you walk up to people who are leaders in a government agency or in a nonprofit, and you talk with them for a little while, you realize that they understand that not having addressed race and institutional racism has severely dampened the effectiveness and impact of our own programs. We have to understand that, because that's why we do the work, so that we can be better at government, at delivering services. We do racial equity work because we want programs for young people, for old seniors to be more effective, right? That has to be the for what. Like we can't just stop with, let's just talk about racial equity. It's like, okay, yeah, let's talk about that. But for what? It's like for better democracy, for better communities, right? So we have to always make sure that we sort of finish that sentence. Don't stop, right? Finish the sentence so that you also keep yourself centered and organized around why we're doing all this detailed work. So maybe those are a technique or an approach. I don't know.
This was useful for me to frame this as well. For me, really kind of thinking about the tools and techniques needs to come from a place of understanding of who you are as a person first, right? And I think we tend to come to these spaces from different backgrounds, from different positionalities, from different understandings of the work that we're doing, and to not really interrogate why you do what you do or who you are, first and foremost, is going to continue to see some of the same issues that we see in public service, but across institutions or organizations at large. The other piece I kind of wanted to bring up is to kind of really think about tools and techniques, because we know that even within this kind of audience that people are watching, there are practitioners that are functioning within public service organizations. We have policymakers, and we also have academics that are also within public administration, now beyond public administration, that are also trying to pull in some kind of ideas about this work. I think talking explicitly about each frame will kind of help us think about those tools and techniques. And I'll start with some of the public service and public organizations that do any type of provide any type of goods and services broadly. I think first is to kind of have a real kind of look, and this is probably the time where I know across institutions we're calling for these ideas of what it really means to be kind of equitable or social, or to really practice social equity. But if you have to have a kind of deep interrogation of like what we said before, why you do this work. The also point is you as an individual, what are you willing to sacrifice to get to the goals that we're calling for, not just here, but across different organizations, institutions largely, right? And I say that as especially in a place of privilege now where I am a faculty member, I have an institute, I have a job, right? But at the same time, I know if I'm not allowed to do the work that I want to do, maybe this would not be the space for me. And I think a lot of times we're scared or we're fearful to really kind of resist, really reproducing some of the same problematic practices and policies that we see within our public service organizations in the face of losing a job. And that's a real fear. But I also want to kind of push us all to kind of really rethink, what are you getting out of being in these positions if you can't really get to the change that you really want to get to? From inside higher education, we've seen this a ton, right? Historically, but even more now, it's like it's on the gas pedals all the way to the floor, where we're really trying to have these kind of conversations about what can happen next. And we understand that higher education functions within this kind of space of public service, right? When we think about how education is supposed to be delivered. And we have deeper conversations about that. But I do think this is a unique time to really kind of, one, uplift the voices of people who have historically been marginalized within the space. Two, understanding the unequitable nature of how this labor has been carried and is continued to be carried by different people, whether that's within a department or within an institution or within a particular college. Three, that if you can just look around and see a lack of diversity within your public service organizations, that should be some cause of concern about why that is, right? And we understand that higher graduation rates for Black women are some of the highest and tend to be higher than the other kind of racial groups and gender groups. But it really kind of begs the question, why are we existing within this frame? And really, what are we doing to not break these kind of change of these old natures of racist practices? I think specifically, we need to kind of interrogate the curriculum in terms of public administration. What are we teaching our students, and how are we preparing practitioners or other policymakers to function in the space? Two, we need to understand that these kind of tools and techniques don't exist just within public service organizations. So I know a number of sociologists, having worked in a sociology department beforehand, that also do very much organizational work, right? I just tweeted about colleague Victor Ray, who had a phenomenal piece on really what it is to have a theory of racialized organizations. But we understand this work has been done historically within other fields, right? Some of my frustration as an academic is that we tend to kind of silo ourselves or isolate ourselves within our particular research areas. And then we don't have these broader discussions, even though our topic or our subfield has synergies with other areas. And this is, and I take this up with understandings of like housing, right? So you see ASPA is one conference, or then you see ACSP as a different conference. And there's very few people that migrate in between those spaces, even though they might be working in the same space, whether it's disaster emergency management, whether it's housing and community development. And I think for more of these kind of conversations need to exist between organizational institutions, but also fields of practice. We see this even at the local level, how particular organizations, depending on the city, may work on homelessness, but they don't really work with other homelessness organizations. And that could be tied to funding mechanisms, right? We understand that all these organizations are fighting for funding or trying to seek grants. But if we're really calling for that kind of addressed or alleviating or even dismantling some of these inequalities that we see, we need to think about more collaborative work that can get us to the end results that we want to get to us collectively. And lastly, I'll say the biggest kind of, before we kind of go into more of this discussion, is that a lot of this work we're thinking we're providing a service for communities without working with communities. And I think that's kind of some of the nature of, you're not providing the space for communities to work with you and kind of really creating their own kind of outcomes, then that's been very problematic. And we see this across the area, whether it's educational outcomes, housing attainment, whatever the case may be. I think a lot of times we tend to think what's best for communities or what's best for groups without understanding what are the real needs and desires of those specific communities and groups within our particular fields of practice or even study. Yeah, I'll stop there.
There's a lot to to follow up on. I know there's a question, so I don't want to take up just 2 minutes though, right?
Whatever time you need.
To Prentiss, like this question of siloing and, why certain housing organizations don't work with each other or won't talk to the food pantry that's down the street or like this and that. I mean, man, so again, this is just an argument. The argument I use to have to analyze this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I think that the more siloing you see on the outside, the more segregation and siloing you have in the internal environment.
Right.
There's a direct correlation, right? And, I've sat there and I've imagined, imagine public administration that rewards performance because it's children who are successfully loved and mentored and cherished in classrooms versus, having teachers filling out forms every single day to see how many minutes they were online or things like that. Imagine there are ways that we have so been hijacked by these metrics that mean nothing except to reproduce white supremacy and control, because all of the frontline staff and the people who actually, there's a whole rich literature and research, both not only in public administration, but definitely in sociology, in terms of sociology of organizations and urban sociology, street level bureaucrats. There is this great literature, and it feels like what's happened, to Prentiss's point, is that there's all these really great observations about how this does not lead, like these types of practices do not lead to great outcomes for the organization themselves, for the people who are in them, and for the communities they're supposed to serve. And then you walk into a human resources management class, and you don't see anything related to that at all. You're like, what? Okay, that's problematic, right? Because it's like you're in two different universes, and those aren't working out. And the people who end up taking jobs in local governments or at nonprofits, get demoralized, and often they'll leave. We know how much turnover there is in both of those types of organizations. So I do think that there is a need to, like, I don't know, push one towards the other. Maybe we meet in the middle, but really to interrogate, like, what are we learning and what is not actually getting taught in our classes, in our core master's classes or public policy classes. Because there is a disconnect.
Yeah, to follow this point just a little bit further, and this came out recently, and a lot of work I've been doing lately to really kind of rethink the system, right? And I think a lot of times, kind of earlier in my career, I was always focused on like the individual organization or the actions of a few individuals, and I think more kind of really relating to this a broader system. And following this point around just housing, right? So segregation is a big issue across the country, and we understand that largely contains or excludes different groups of people from resources and other opportunities. One point that was put out there, and I think this was in Lance Freeman's latest book, A Haven in the Hell, The Ghetto in Black America, was that the system is the more important way to kind of look at it, right? And I think that's why, like, naming white supremacy, naming racism is the first step. Because even when we think about the kind of maintenance of slavery or even the plantation, right? You had very low levels of segregation, but a larger political economy by which you had a subservient group of people in the same space with a ruler, right? So we think about the relationship between kind of the master and the slave. And we see a lot of these kind of similar ideas where when we think about segregation, it's not just about the idea that opening up these kind of communities, but also allowing the kind of resources or these communities that tend to be ethnic enclaves or segregate themselves to thrive on their own, right? In a lot of ways, when we see this, even when different racial groups or even different organizations function, right, and to provide the utmost highest levels of kind of output, we see they get dismantled. So we have these ideas of like the Black Wall Street, we have these ideas of Rosewood, and as they come up, but I think that's part of the kind of first crux, and we bring this back to the when we started this conversation, is really rethinking about this idea of what is the political economy, or what is that system that we're functioning within, right? And without naming it as an exploitative or as a form of oppression, I think we tend to kind of debate or argue or discuss the individual level stuff that we're trying to get to, but even how those individual kind of actions get manifested at the organizational level. So part of it for me is to really understand, kind of really grapple with this idea about what are we really as an organization or as a field trying to get to? What do we expect from our institutions or organizations? And how can we really better work with communities and not for communities and getting to some of these outcomes that we largely say we want? And I think without really kind of detackling or doing that or decoupling that work, we're really going to get to the same space and have the same kind of conversation next year or the year after, or even in the near future.
Great, excellent. This was a fantastic discussion here. So at this point, we would like to open it up to audience Q&A. If you do have a question you would like to ask, please send it through to in the chat. And the first question we received is from Wendy Nicholson. She's going to be put her off mute. Let me just go ahead and find her in the list. Okay, 1 second. Oh, there we are. There we are. So, Wendy, you should now be unmuted.
Okay, I'm here.
Glad that worked.
All right, we got it this time. Awesome. Thank you so much. This has been a great conversation. I'm Wendy Nicholson. I'm a second-year doctoral student at Rutgers Newark. My question is, how do we ensure that public policies that specifically address issues for people of color, let's just say for maybe a Black business owner or Black business owners, how do we make sure that those policies and processes are developed and implemented in the context of a system? Because if it's just a policy about business, it doesn't address all the other things that would have impacted that along the way: housing, education, so forth. So how do we begin to ensure that those things happen in the context of system thinking?
I'll start. Thank you for your question. This is a really good question. I think part of it, and this is as an urbanist, for me, context really matters. Like, urbanists are constantly saying that place matters. And for me, context really matters in these particular spaces. So we have problems, and we can see this across the municipalities, metro areas, states, whatever level of geography we want to really talk about. We see these kind of policies that tend to group or consider all these organizations as similar when they're not, right? And I think this has been a case for working with a colleague, Ashley Nichols, and thinking about these ideas of low capacity versus high capacity organizations, right? Thinking about particular organizations that serve racial groups versus that deal with other type of social service or other communities. And I think that calls us to really think about how these spaces or these kind of organizations are different from the majority, and how can we create different policies. I think part of the ways in which we've been thinking about systems is that this is how the system works, right? And this is how the organization works within the system, without thinking like, no, these are how different organizations work. And by working within their individual space, they create a different type of system. So I think there's a large problem in kind of public service or even public administration for thinking very much of a top-down approach without thinking bottom-up. And to explicitly or to like kind of really simplify this kind of this answer is, I think part of to get to these better policies or these better outcomes is to really kind of think about where organizations, where they're at, and then framing a different institutional structure that can be supportive of different types of organizations. I think without doing that, we're going to get to some of the same issues that you alluded to the question about the fact that these types of systems don't really function to allow different organizations to see. And a lot of times we end up undercutting organizations that do the work that we're really calling for, that really address some of the inequalities or inequities that we see across these different spaces.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. The only two things I'd add to that response is maybe also, again, Wendy, like this question of, I would have some questions, like, so I'll make some assumptions, like, where's this funding coming from to support Black-owned businesses, right? Is it some well-meaning private foundation that needs to like spend $1 million to help itself feel better? Okay, that's fine. Take the money, but if it actually doesn't change the internal budgeting process of a municipality, of a department, that should be, in fact, spending more money to support Black-owned businesses, minority-owned businesses, then it's the Band-Aid. It's the thing that, at least what I'm heartened by is the fact that we know this now. We can call it out and we can show that that's not the solution. The solution is to take the money and to invest it, sure, like never turn away money. But then to turn around within the internal environment and say, how do we actually enact equity when it comes to our business ownership programs? Like, how do we know that we are indeed providing more to them? Because equity demands that we provide more to those who need more. If that sets off an interrogation and a real internal struggle and a calling out of, then as a government, why don't we just budget more for that and budget less for something that we might actually not need, right? So I think that's one thing. I think about the second piece is, Kenneth Meyer was a political scientist. I remember reading an article of his around representative bureaucracy, and he did most of his work around teachers. But there was always this one thing that I always carry with me, because it's the hope that I have for this work. That in his extensive research, all this research he did, right? And he was looking at how when you have more Black and brown teachers, then, oh, look, like the Black and brown kids in the classroom did better, right? And so we represented bureaucracy, we get that. One of the most compelling findings that I often return to over and over again when I'm doing this work is he also found that there was a statistically significant increase in white student performance in classrooms that had Black and brown teachers. So this idea of a zero-sum game, like somehow if you give more money in a city budget to Black-owned businesses and somehow white-owned businesses are going to lose out, is not true. We need more stories. We need more evidence. Those of you doing research, we need to continue to make the case, right? And to connect those dots, because I'm referring to an article I think that was written like 1999, right? Like, so we need more of these cases and to continue to compile them to show the general public, to show administrators that this isn't a zero-sum game. If you do this right and you actually implement this within your own structures internally, everyone's going to benefit, not just a certain group of people. So I would say yes, both and.
And just to follow that last point, like, we need more of this, and we also, as organizations, institutions, we need to allow this space for the this knowledge to come about, right? And I think a lot of times we kind of, even in academia, right, we cherry pick what are the main voices that we highlight within these spaces. But there's a lot of times where we know some of the same things that a lot of us are studying are stuff that we knew before we even went to graduate school, right? And I think this is the kind of irony within this space, is that a lot of the work I've been doing in housing policy is things that I learned beyond the academy, right? I kind of already knew why public housing was getting demolished in my neighborhood. I kind of already knew about how people use housing assistance in the particular neighborhoods and the roles that they've been dealing with landlords. And a lot of times we're late to the game in terms of academia, and we all know why, right? It takes a long time usually to get a paper out or even a book out. And then by the time it's really received by the audience and responded to, years go by. So if we can, at least in our own organizations or our spaces, provide the environment for this type of knowledge to get out there at a faster pace, I think that starts these conversations and gets us on the right track of doing this type of work. The other piece, and this is something that was always kind of pushed into me in my, as a fellow Rutgers graduate, is that this idea of that there's a lot of local knowledge at the community level, right? And if you ask people who are working with administrators or practitioners in the spaces, a lot of times they can point out every rule or lack of efficiency that's actually working within that individual level, and really relying on that kind of feedback or that kind of engagement with communities at where they're at can really kind of redirect the policies and the practices that you're doing as an administrator, but also yield better outcomes for communities at large.
Yeah.
Okay, this was fantastic. So we've been seeing quite a lot of questions coming in through the chat, both visibly as well as us directly. Prentiss and I have been doing our best to try to moderate these. So the next one looks like it would really nicely build on this, is from Morgan Johansson. Morgan, I believe you should be unmuted right now.
Aloha, everyone. It's 6 o'clock in the morning for me here in Hawaii. But this is a very interesting conversation, so it's definitely waking me up. So Hawaii is an extremely heavy collective bargaining state. And so I wanted to ask you, how do you think, what role have public sector unions played in perpetuating white supremacy? And how can we educate our students on how to work on equity issues within the collective bargaining context?
That was a
You want to say?
Prentiss, if you want to take a crack at it, or I can, and we can go back and forth.
Yeah. So I'll take a crack at it for just the way I think about unions holistically, but also we're also try to push some other kind of experts to comment on this as well outside this space. I think part of it is to think about that unions as a form of organizations or a local form of community groups can also be very exclusionary. And I think part of it is to understand that at certain points unions are fighting for the overall collective group, but in different sectors, they have been created, right, to establish their own sense of rights and while excluding the rights of others, even if they're like worker to worker or peer to peer or coworker to coworker. Particularly as we think about it in terms of like how current unions actually practice within these spaces, I think we need to come to terms of where, yes, unions also call into a bigger question, right? And I think that's part of the kind of nature of this overall discussion, call into a bigger question of the role of the individual, right, within a bigger organization. And at times, those kind of discussions need to be had, whether it's collective bargaining groups within higher education or manufacturing, whatever kind of the field is. But those conversations need to be happening. Part of me wants to, and like the sociologist in me really wants to push back on this idea of like, well, when we think about the ways in which kind of the plant or the workforce really functions, there is this idea of capitalism. There is this idea of there are systems of capitalism. There are systems of neoliberalism that really exclude or further exacerbate, exploit different groups of individuals within these particular spaces. And I don't think you can really kind of get students to really understand why a union actually exists without having bigger kind of issues about how does this organization or this industry function within a larger set of organizations and industries. I mean, to the flip side, I think we have been, at least as far as this conversation has been going on and how these kind of conversations have been framed, we're talking about racism as one form of a system, right? But we do understand that there are other intersecting kind of systems of inequality or other systems of oppression, right? So we can think about patriarchy. We can think about, I'm losing track. We can think about patriarchy. We can think about heteronormativity. We could think about crystal normativity as they're functioning within these spaces, right? But today, at least, we're starting these conversations about anti-racism, but you can't be anti-racist without really tackling patriarchy. You can't be anti-racist without thinking about the impacts of capitalism. You can't be anti-racist without thinking about these other systems of normality, as we would call them, right? The everyday ordinary things that we've been doing, functioning as intersecting with these kind of systems of oppression. I don't know if that really answers your question, but I do think it's a bigger question in terms of thinking about, yes, what is the role of that local kind of union and how does it function within this particular space or this particular organization? But also understand that sometimes unions too, in and of themselves, can also be exclusionary. So we think about their relationship with the workers individually or internally, but we also think about their role with the state or those kind of, what is the kind of rules about these collective bargaining agreements with larger kind of systems.
Yeah. Yeah, this is a big question. I mean, you know, labor is not a monolith. So, I mean, I heard you talk about public sector unions in particular. So I think that, I mean, the one piece that I could add to what Prentiss really framed out really well about I mean, multiple intersectionalities is just, you know, when you have, he's right, he was right, like to point out that, you know, the orientation of unions is to protect their members. And you can't blame them given the history of neoliberalism and all of the ways in which unions have suffered and been attacked. So we get that, all right? But there is a certain point where I guess in a simple way, I would just say, I do think that a lot of public sector unions could use a whole bunch of racial equity work internally within its leadership structure and you know, just the kind of bargaining positions they take, because you know, there's just a certain point where as an outside observer, you know, like and professional associations sometimes are part of a professional public sector union, sometimes they aren't, but you know, the most common one right now we're all looking at, of course, are police unions, fraternal orders of police. So I'm going to set that one aside because we could talk about that for another 2 hours, and I'm sure that Sean and Parissa have a whole workshop on that. But let's
We
just
do.
take some. Okay, see, so I mean, I'll set that one aside. But one of the issues that we deal with in Illinois is that we have an extremely strong professional association. Again, I don't know if they operate like a union, of school superintendents. And we have a lot of districts, like we have like 112, don't quote me on it. And every single time we try to talk about reform, talk about how we move money back into classrooms, how we buy more support for students who need it more and all this stuff, huge pushback, right? It's just, it's a constant, and you can look at the system, right? So to Prentiss's point, it's like you look at the system of funding and how inequitable. And sure, you could say, hey, well, you know, property taxes and this and that, but you cannot avoid that if you have a 3-school district and you have a superintendent and an assistant superintendent, there is inequity there as well. But there is like a certain point where that cannot be discussed. And it really does undermine sort of the sense of, well, where is the racial equity and understanding how you protect your members' interests and the interests of your members as members of democracy, of society, of these communities. Like, how do you do it? It should be a both and. It shouldn't be, in order for me to protect that contract, we're going to throw XYZ under the bus. Now, some of the most exciting organizing that's been happening, of course, in progressive unions is when you get this intersectionality, and there's tons of examples. So I'm not saying that that's not happening, but what I am saying is that internally, maybe there is some opportunity to do more of that racial equity work in the internal environment for unions as well.
Wonderful. So this discussion of systems has really inspired a lot of other questions. M. Wilson is going to be going next. M. Wilson, you should be off mute right now.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for this great conversation. I think one question that I have, and Prentiss, you mentioned it a little bit before, was patriarchy and like trying to understand how the interworkings of patriarchy, capitalism, white supremacy, and so many others are working together. And I think your answer to the last question left a little bit to be desired. And I'm not like being shady, but just because you mentioned them as separate entities and not the actual, like how they interplay and always will interwork with each other. And I kind of want to answer or pose to the two of you a question of how do we begin to dismantle a system if we see them as disparate entities and not a full interplay, because we can't talk about white supremacy without talking about patriarchy. We can't talk about white supremacy without talking about capitalism, like you mentioned before. And we actually have to understand that they are all connected and you can never disconnect them. And if you do, then you're always going to leave somebody out. And so you all also mentioned it in answers to your first question. But I want to see how organizations can start to dismantle or disentangle how these systems of domination are working together in like actual tangible ways. And I'm not saying that like you all are able to do that kind of labor, but just as a thought experiment.
Sure, and just to clarify too, right? So I think part of how I'm thinking about it, and this could be an individual basis, but part of how I'm thinking about it is, one, I do think we need to be explicit about how these individual systems kind of work on their own, but also, like you pointed out, right, they are mutually dependent or mutually constitutive upon one another, right? And when we think about the ways in which kind of And we know this, right? It works in terms of a matrix of oppression, and not just like, oh, racism is this force that we can dismantle, but then we're left with patriarchy or capitalism or XYZ, right? All these other systems of oppression, without understanding that they're, like you pointed out, mutually dependent upon one another to actually see these type of outcomes that we're seeing. I think part of it is to understand, right, at different points in times, the kind of unbreaking of these kind of intersecting systems calls for a particular attention to each one, but also paying a particular attention to each the other ones, right? So, and I say this, and here's a clear kind of example of that. When we think about kind of urban studies or just housing, right, as one case study or one example, we can understand segregation, right? As having a huge impact on particularly communities of color. You cannot understand even the best well-intentioned anti-discriminatory housing bills to reduce discrimination at the local level, to open up communities, still will not get communities of color to the same space or even the same outcomes that we see, just because from a capitalistic standpoint, housing is very exploitative in that means, right? So when you want to buy a house, you compete with other people to buy a house. You'll end up paying more for this house. You don't care what happens to those other groups of people. And we've pushed this as a dominant narrative or a dominant ideology that everybody should buy a home, right? That's from a historical nature of colonial property ownership as a colonial form or and we tend to reproduce that. So I do think at certain times you need to kind of focus in on those as individual entities, but also notice the ways in which they intersect and become mutually dependent forms of oppression to get to this overall understanding of white supremacy. And yeah, I want to make sure that I'm really clear with that. It's not just that, you know, this one works this way and this one works this way. Yes, they have tools and mechanisms by which they get reproduced, but they also intersect with each other in interesting ways to get differential outcomes, right? And we see this, and this is what the kind of work of intersectionality really calls us to do, is to really unpack the ways in which, yes, we can think about different social movements that have been well-informed, right? So when we think about the women's movement has been exclusionary to Black women, we can also think about the civil rights movement has been very exclusionary to Black women historically, right? When we think about the civil rights movement. So that at different points in time, these systems, while they may be either well-intentioned or they may be exploited for oppressive in certain spaces, they are mutually dependent and intersect in interesting ways, which calls for different types of policies or programmatic action at the organizational or individual level. Yeah, I'll stop there.
I think you're still on mute, Dr. Yang-Clayton.
I will unmute myself. Sorry. I was listening intently, and you know, maybe one additional component to the thought experiment that you've posed for us is we remove this idea of linearity, right? Like somehow it's like, you know, we're going to go from like stage to stage to stage. I definitely think that, you know, these big societal things like patriarchy and capitalism and you know, white supremacy, that they are societal level kinds of issues that sometimes escape me. Like I do think it has to be seen as a cycle or iterative in terms of how we see those big picture and like those big concepts actually manifesting themselves on the individual level. And then where do we situate ourselves in order to take advantage in the best possible ways, the opportunities that the change in individual level attitudes towards patriarchy, towards gender, towards, you know, everything is what we're experiencing right now. I mean, that's what I was trying to say earlier, is that I feel like there is just something that is happening where you have generations, and maybe it's not just the younger generations, like even in like the older, more tired generation that I'm in, or like above me, it's like there is this sensibility of what is happening to our planet and climate change and the relationship between that and capitalism and patriarchy and the way, I mean, so there are these connections that I think we're all benefiting from, those of us who do think about like those bigger societal concepts that I'm not exactly sure how we would influence that beyond being prepared to take advantage of those moments institutionally to demand real change, like real institutional, like dismantling institutionalized racism, putting in those structures of inclusion, and demanding that they get put in, that we're smart enough now. I feel like just collectively we have done enough research that if someone comes along and says, yeah, we're gonna respond to your concerns about police brutality by setting up a commission, no one's buying that anymore. Have you noticed that? No one's buying it. They're like, nope, right? So, and instead, the whole list of these are all the changes we actually want. Here's who we want you to fund. So we need to continue that pressure. The protests are working, and the pressure for institutions to change is going to be a lot. We need a lot of that and consistent, because we're not going to fix this in 6 months. So I don't know if that helps, but it's iterative, I think.
Really quick to add on this point, because especially given the audience and the nature of this kind of conversation, I would say that a lot of times when we talk about racism, patriarchy, capitalism, whatever the kind of system that we're talking about, we tend to think about this very much abstract thing, right? And it's like, how can I as an individual, as an administrator, as a practitioner, really try to, if I even with the most well-intentions, really break down that overall system, right? One is that we're individuals that work within a larger collective. And I think that's part of the kind of work that we need to really kind of understand, that this is not just for the individual. The individual is one piece of it that needs to be working in a larger collective and larger movements. Mm-hmm. Two is that in tangible ways, how can we really see this at the organization level, right? And a lot of ways in which we think about government, the role of nonprofits, the role of the other kind of non-governmental institutions, is that the work they've been doing tends to be similar to the work they were doing 10 years ago or even 20 years ago, right? Without really a deep engagement of why they're doing what they're doing, as we talked about earlier, but also the kind of assessments or the metrics that they're holding each other in the organization accountable for, or the lack thereof. And what I mean by that is that there are certain points in time that we can look internally at our organization and look at things like family leave, or things about what are we being evaluated yearly with our bosses. And we understand that those tend to be very much gendered or biased based on how the organization has historically been run. I think without really kind of untangling the different forms of assessment and evaluation, whether we see it for a local nonprofit and their outcomes for the end of the year, right? So we know a lot of local community groups that do work with youth development here in Atlanta, and they may not have the extraordinary numbers in terms of outreach, but when you actually go and actually interview the children that they actually work with, or the youth, you see the drastic outcomes that are explicit within those. So I think by developing different sets of metrics and assessments to hold different types of organizations accountable, without doing this kind of one size fits all across the institutional or organizational field, would start to get at some of these types of breakdowns. I think the other point is that where's the accountability actually coming from? And who are you as an organization actually kind of responsible to, right? Are you responsible to the community that you're actually working with? Are you responsible to a larger board? Are you getting your funding from a private foundation? And also understanding the limits within that particular space, right? A lot of times you can't do certain things because it's dictated by your funder or even your board of directors at an organizational level. And really having kind of deeper engagements with these kind of institutions I would think would get to some of that historic change. I've seen this in higher ed, for instance. We have, certain schools have endowments that are specifically for one thing. If you're scared to lose that money without actually asking, like, why are we giving money to this thing that was given, over the last 30 years, we have this award that we give, one student in our department, without really thinking about how can we break up this money to really be more equitable across the department. These are the little things that we can do in our organizations to think about, are we definitely preferencing or prioritizing certain opportunities or certain kind of areas without really thinking about why we're really doing it. And I think it gets back to this kind of bigger question that was in the question that Megan posed, was that yes, these are tangible ways that these things can work and intersect with each other, right? But there also needs to be a questioning about why we're doing what we're doing. And I think for me, that's where I start versus coming out to this idea like, oh, these inequalities exist. All right, now what are we going to do to fix these inequalities without really kind of understanding or interrogating why they exist in the first place?
Yes, yeah. I mean, just to put, I've been looking at some of the comments in the chat thing. I don't know if I'm allowed to do that, but I mean,
of course. Yeah.
You know, I see things like about colonialism and, you know, neocolonialism, and I get that. I think to myself, you know, as I was going through grad school, there was like this, you know, and this was like in the 2000s, right? And so, you know, this like big push, especially among progressives, to always want to look at national level issues. Like everyone wanted to set up a shop in DC. Everyone wanted to do global stuff, right? And meanwhile, actually 20 years before the 2000s, you know, neoconservative right-wing movements were actively colonizing at the state and local level. And they were setting up think tanks and organizing shops and running campaigns and taking over state legislatures. And I mean, when you really think about it, where all our chickens are coming home to roost, like you can almost map that right onto that strategy. And so I looked at that pretty deeply, and I said to myself, just personally, I'm kind of done with the national and the global stuff right now. We need to figure out how to build capacity, real capacity, not the scraps that get thrown at us by our national organizations after they pay all their salaries, but really state by state, locally, we need to fund this type of thinking, of collaborating. You know, Brandy was pointing out like new tools, different tools. We don't use the same tools that built racism, right? We need different ways, but we can't concentrate all of our energy in DC or say we need to do this globally. I would like this to be happening, and some of it is happening. I'm not saying that it's not. It's just there is a tendency in our movements to always want to do something nationally, and it just reflects an absence of really understanding how power really needs to be formed. So I am all for local, state level. Let's do this state by state, and then figure out how we get it done on a national level.
And these are fantastic questions. And just to point in the direction of the chat, excuse me, there are a lot of great comments there. Unfortunately, we won't be able to get them all, but I think they really demonstrate why this cannot just be one webinar, not even one series. It has to be across ASPA, across APSA, across all these organizations. And as Dr. Blessed said, these different ways of doing things, because just quote here directly, Audre Lorde says the master's tools will not dismantle the master's house. We absolutely need different new creative ways of doing things. So with that, I believe that the next question in the queue is from Susan, Dr. Susan Gooden. So Dr. Gooden, you should now be unmuted.
Thank you so much. And I'd like to express my thanks and appreciation to the Democracy and Social Justice section for hosting this webinar. And it's great to see so many people in attendance. I just wanted to have a comment about the zero-sum game. And you know, I think there are situations in which there may be zero-sum game, and that's great. That's fantastic if we can do that. But I also think we have to also think about the whole premise of trying to get to equity is that we've had longstanding inequities. And so I think we also have to be transparent that is going to require sacrifice, and that is going to require a righting of some wrongs. And I think one of the things that's problematic, and this sort of goes with the rising tide lifts all boats argument, is that I think when we're having discussions about white supremacy, we have to get on the table, why is it that if there is if sacrifice is required in order to get to equity, then that's problematic. It either has to be zero-sum game, or it has to be rising tide lifts all boats. That in and of itself is problematic. I mean, if we really just think about that, what are we saying? We're saying we want to get there, but we don't want individuals who have been privileged to have to sacrifice it all. And I think as we navigate both of these pandemics, I think there are some lessons to be learned. You know, with the coronavirus, you know, I would like to not be exposed to the coronavirus, but I'd also like to be able to go outside and hang out with my friends and, you know, not wear a mask and all of these things. But, you know, all these things can't coexist. And so I think we have to be very explicit about that. And I think we should also unpack why is that, you know, what are the difficulties there in delivering that message? And what does that say itself about white supremacy?
Yeah, I think for me, thank you for the comment. And it's been in the back of my mind for a lot of times, especially with kind of these recent calls for reparations, or what does that really mean across different spaces. Even working with some colleagues on some stuff in terms of housing policy, but yeah, it's the monopoly game, right? If you tell me that you can play this game, and you've one group of people have largely been able to kind of play this game for years and reap all these benefits, and now all of a sudden we bring you to the game and say, hey, you want to play this game now, right? And we get to these same types of inequalities and inequities without understanding what does the sacrifice really mean. And I think that's a debate and a conversation that most people just don't want to have. I think part of it is that even when you think about people that wanted to be engaged in this type of work, right? And not that it needs to be selective, but it needs to be the entire field. I think that's part of the bigger issue. As even the last comment in terms of Dr. Blessed, right? You can't use the same tools. And I think this fits into a bigger kind of commentary in terms of like what we're really talking about here, is that, yeah, you just have to radically think about what we're doing different, but also there needs to be some type of redistribution about resources that tend to never be on the table. And I think about that a lot of times, and even in the kind of housing space, but even just urban policy in general, when we think about what cities have been thriving and which ones have been left to quote unquote die, that's been very problematic. And we don't think about the ways in which we can really do this different. I don't see a lot of, and then even at the institutional or even at the kind of local government level, we tend to have these bigger debates about what it really means to kind of think about these systems differently. So part of it is, yes, I think part of it is that we need to have these kind of rectifying or these writings of the wrongs of the past, right? Whether it's reparations or what that really means is a bigger kind of policy area that I think we really need to debate about, right? So even when we talk about reparations and other forms of kind of interventions at that local level, even the bill that was at Congress, right, was to study the impact of slavery and racism. And we kind of already see the impact of that, right? So when do we get to those ideas of what those tools really mean even at the local level, but even at an organizational level, right? When we think about why these inequalities exist, are we just alleviating or mitigating some of the impact rather really than changing the circumstances by which people were put in these positions in the first place?
So, I mean, I think, Dr. Gooden, your point about all boats being lifted probably is pretty directly tied to the observation that I was making about how, when you do get more representative bureaucracy in certain cases, that you actually get better organizational performance outcomes for everyone, not just a particular group. And I think I'm trying to think about it. It's like, was that intended to mean that we can only make a case for racial equity if we make sure that white people benefit too? And that I don't think that wasn't my intention, but it might have come off that way. I think my intention was to say that we can and should build more impactful and relevant government programs for everyone. And if that means that we have more representative bureaucracy, if that means that we spend more on communities and programs that need more, let's do that. And if white people benefit as much as other communities benefit, that's great. But, I guess my focus was really around, but then we demonstrate and prove that government is necessary, that it is a critical core component of a representative democracy, that we need both in order for us to actually get to some place in the future that is the America that we all want. Not the one that we have to fix or make great again or revision or all that stuff, like to Dr. Blessed's point, yes, to something new. And if that new piece is that, we all come together and we're like, government is actually the thing that we need, that we're gonna fund completely, and not just police departments, so that our democracy functions at the highest levels that it can and should and never has, I'm okay with that. But yeah, I mean, I have to think about that more in terms of how to frame it so it doesn't come off as let's justify it. But just to be real, in terms of like the internal work that I'm doing right now in some organizations where 60% of the staff are white, I wouldn't necessarily push the alternative point super hard right now, just because we're still trying to build that trust and stuff. So it's an interesting question. I'll think about it more.
And along that lines, just before we go to the next question, I do want to kind of reiterate some pieces that I've heard in conversations outside of this conversation, but I've heard in conversations that term this work, right? I think it's very telling when we're talking about, when we say racism, for me, I'm particularly looking at anti-Black racism, right? So I'm looking at this particular form of racism and its impact. I think a lot of times, even when we think about diversity, what does that really mean? Because we've seen organizations be anti-Black, but also diversify their organizations, right? So I think for me, it's really thinking about the ways in which kind of even in the ways in which we think about the policies or the programmatic changes that we can make, they can still reproduce these type of anti-Blackness within organizations or institutions going forward. And without having a critical engagement or deep engagement with what that really means in terms of the work is really telling for organizations. I think it's really telling for organizations to kind of grapple with internally, but also thinking about it. Why do you see some of these kind of reproductions of inequalities, right? So we see this in higher education, right? So there will be a number of calls for like diversifying, particularly hiring more Black faculty. But it's also really just the numbers, and just having them there does not really change the overall institutional structure if you're not really thinking about what are the policies, what is the labor load, what is the teaching load, and requiring these individuals to take upon more of the burden to satisfy this kind of racial justice work. And I think without really kind of interrogating, one, the institution, but also how are you individually contributing to get to real racial justice, then we'll tend to have some of the same outcomes or even diluted outcomes that we really want to call for here.
Mm.
Okay, this is fantastic. We have about 7 minutes left. I'd just like to emphasize again that the time flew by. There's great questions in the chat. Why this absolutely has to be a bigger discussion and not just in this field. And also, I've been communicating with Dr. Blessed. We just really like to reemphasize this is the start of a series. We are going to be having many webinars on this topic. We hope you're going to be able to join all of them. With that, I'd like to turn over the floor to Prentiss Dantzler, who's DSJ social media editor, who's going to take a lot of these comments and questions and weave them together, but also really ask about action orientation. So Prentiss, the floor is yours.
Yeah, so thank you so much, Sean. Thank you to our panelists, and thank you to all of our wonderful participants here. So something just wanted to address up front before the question, and that is we have an amazing brain trust here to leverage with all the people on this collective call. So I want to emphasize, please reach out to us, and we're going to give options how to engage besides just the webinar. But to our panelists, as part of what we at DSJ are hoping to do or planning to do with this series, we're looking to build a framework of action for dismantling white supremacy. So keeping that in mind, and keep in mind all the questions and comments so far and some of what you both shared today, what are you seeing as some of those essential first steps or steps forward? So that's to kind of help us guide us to our next webinar and generally as an outcome for this entire series. Thank you.
Yeah, practically, and this is current, right? So practically, if you haven't engaged in any conversations in your organization about what's currently going on, then that's very problematic and very telling about the organization, no matter what frame or field or subfield that you work in. If you haven't had conversations about action items to call for at the institutional organizational level, then that's very telling to like how you're contributing in terms of these systems. If you haven't had the courage, or if you've been very passive in these conversations because you don't feel like you as an individual should be doing this work, then that's very telling of the organization. I think going forward, at least for a professional association like ASPA, even in the section, it's hard for me to grapple with this idea that we're talking about white supremacy and racism, but it's not central to how ASPA should be functioning, right? There's no deep engagement about kind of racial justice when we're thinking about social service organizations or public or service organizations. I think it speaks to the nature of how we kind of silo or isolate this work as on the fringes of the practice without understanding that cultural competency, social equity should be central to how we do this work. I think going forward, we need to have kind of bigger conversations individually, but also collectively, at least within our own organizations, about next steps going forward. So for me, in higher education, is really thinking about curriculum development. It's really thinking about the recruitment and retention of students. It's really thinking about creating those opportunities, at least in-house, for our students to thrive, but particularly being in a city like Atlanta with a long history. But you can see this work being done at any particular city, right? Because we do understand that the academy tends to be kind of very exclusionary and very reproducing of the same type of issues that we're talking about here. Holistically, I think we all need to be doing this work in terms of thinking about, one, having that being brave enough to have these conversations, come to this space of where you're at and understand that it needs to be a place of open dialogue where you can hash out some of these issues, but also have accountability measures. I think it's a lot to say a statement and say, yeah, we support, the constant demonstrations across America, but without having any teeth to the game, at least internally, then we're going to have the same type of inequalities or inequities existing long term. I think there needs to be action items at the organizational staff, whether it's like a redefining or a re-engagement with your own practices and policies in your programs. Also, issues of diversity, inclusion, and equity. What does that really mean at the institutional or organizational level? But even going forward, what are the metrics to even evaluate yourself and hold yourself accountable, right? Is it you're going to revisit this in the 30 to 60 to 90 days to see where you're at based on the primary or the preliminary conversations that you're having? Are you going to revisit it in a due time, or is this going to be just a one-off? And I think without really kind of having an honest answer to those type of questions, we tend to reproduce the same practices or actions that we were talking about before.
Okay, so I have 2 minutes, so I'm gonna just try to focus in on a couple of things.
Have as much time as you need, Doctor.
Okay, thank you. I like the way that Dr. Dantzler was focusing on organizational stuff, so I'm gonna just kind of wander around that space a little bit. One of the things that I have been asking a lot about within my department is what we teach within the core MPA core classes that have something to do with both racial equity, but also deliberative democracy. There's an intersection between those two that I think really is pretty critical right now that we actually expose future public servants to. And so we're kind of doing an audit right now, and I'm just trying to kind of push a little bit around are there ways that we can really include more of that material so that we're really arming, not in a, we're educating and arming our students to be so much more receptive to the possibilities of what co-produced policies look like and, what communities actually know that they need. So that's like a next step, if you guys are involved in that or something, maybe just to kind of pick up on it and to ask, what are we teaching? What are the concrete things? I think one thing that I just wanted to throw out there is absolutely, if there's some way for us to continue expanding this space where the distinction and difference between racial disparities studies versus what we're talking about here, which is critical race theories, and just that, we got to keep on being clear about what we need more of, which I'm just going to say it's critical race, and how we incorporate that into the critical thinking skills also that we pass on to our students. And then finally, I don't know, I had this third piece where it's just really if you want to get to next steps and you're working with a nonprofit or you're working with a government agency, I've found that it's absolutely critical to try to establish some sense of shared fate within that organization, that if they don't address race and institutionalized racism, that they're not going to make it, that they will continue to decline, and that you can point out so many examples where the absence of a racial approach, a framework, has undermined a lot of the policies and programs they thought were really awesome, and people just didn't show up, or they fled, or they're no longer thriving, or they're no longer there. I mean, you can make these arguments fairly clear to get more organizations on that path to understanding that racial equity, or just dealing with white supremacy, is not a nice to have anymore. It is a you have to deal with this if you want to be more impactful and to serve your communities in the future. So I would start from there.
Excellent. Well, with that, we are at time. I'm going to be sharing a couple links with everyone over the chat. I just really would like to thank everyone for attending, but a special thanks to Dr. Dantzler and Dr. Yang-Clayton. It was wonderful, wonderful conversation. We did record this event, and we will, after running it by our panelists, we'll be releasing it on our YouTube page. And we hope you're going to join us for our webinar tomorrow on ethical competency and the others coming up. As I mentioned, this is the first webinar in a series on dismantling white supremacy. And our next one will be held on July 6th from 1 to 2:30 p.m. I'll be focusing on dismantling white supremacy in the academy. We are going to be having a flyer and an RSVP link soon, and hope you all sign up. Other big piece of news, we in DSJ are pleased to be partnering with the journal Administrative Theory and Praxis to co-sponsor a dialogue series on dismantling white supremacy. So please keep an eye out for that call soon. And finally, this link from the section on public administration education, who started a Perspectives in PA video series linked to these efforts to combat racism and promote equity in PA. So see this link here that they've created regarding questions you may have about teaching equity. And we're going to be following up with those who RSVP'd for your ideas on future webinars, panelists, and more. And you're always welcome to write to us at our Gmail there. And as we go, let's just remember that it is our duty to understand and dismantle these systems of oppression, whether it's the personal, group, organizational, systemic, or societal levels, especially if we want public administration to live up to its mandate to improve lives, or if we need to have even new creative ways of engaging in these endeavors. There's no time like right now. So thank you for joining, and keep an eye out for the recording soon. So bye, everyone.